Well, hello, friends. So glad to have you joining us for our message this week. Last week we didn't post anything online. We had a special speaker, Les Parr, who is the pastor at the Vineland Native American Chapel just south of town, and it was wonderful to sit under his ministry and just hear how God has worked in his life and ministry over the years. But I'm glad to be back with you today. So I'm working my way right now through a book that part of the book recounts some of the racism in the South in the United States in the early 1900s. The stories almost make me sick to my stomach. I'm just not aware of all of the horrific things that were done during that time frame. I find it hard to believe that even a small percentage of Americans were capable of such atrocities toward other human beings. Certainly, many of you over the last 8 months have been paying attention to the stories coming out of Israel and Gaza, and those stories have sickened honest people everywhere. Barbaric doesn't seem like it's an appropriate adjective to describe what took place first on October 7th. And then in Israel's response afterwards, I don't want to get into the political aspects of it, we certainly can all agree, at least on this much, that God's heart weeps when lives are lost, the way that lives are being lost right now, the way that lives were just brutally lost on October 7th. Jesus believes that every child born in Israel, every child born in Gaza, is worth dying for. It should matter to us. I hope it matters to you. So we see brutality in recent history. We see it in history going back 75 years. And we see it in far ancient history as well. In 2011, on our final trip home to America from visiting Africa for the last time, Nancy and I were traveling with our daughter Diana, and we had 3 days to spend in London, England, to explore that amazing, amazing city that we would love to go back and visit again. And I'm not a big history museum guy, but boy, one of the museums that we went to, I'll just never forget. It was just absolutely fascinating. We saw how back in the days of the British Empire, the British would conquer a geographic area, and then they would bring back spoils of war, and these were showcased at some places in the city, but then also in this museum that we visited. They actually brought back like marble columns, if you can imagine that. They brought back monuments that they took down in the countries that they conquered and then rebuilt in areas of London. They brought back parts of walls of buildings that had carved figures in them from the territories that they conquered. It was quite amazing. Diana laughed as she imagined like a general coming home and greeting the King of England and saying, "We won! And hey, by the way, look at the 90-foot obelisk that I brought home for you as a gift." It's almost sickening in some respects. Much of it came from the Middle East, where often Middle Eastern histories were not recorded on paper or parchment. Their history was carved in stone. And the carvings are their historical record. I don't share this next part lightly with you. Some of this is going to be uncomfortable to hear. I get that. It's going to be worse for me to do it Sunday, trust me, in front of our people here on a day when people are coming to worship. But after I read and studied about some of what I'm going to share, I've come to a different angle, different perspective, different understanding of one of the books of the Bible. I've been able to see it a little bit more through eyes that understood more of what must have been going through the minds of those who were involved in that period of history. You see, one biblical civilization whose history is pretty accurately determined from carvings in buildings, some of which ended up in the British Museum that we visited, was the Assyrian Empire. You perhaps have heard of it. Not Syria, but Assyria. Two different regions, two different nations, if you will. The Assyrian Empire during its day was very powerful. in the region that is now around Iraq, all right? And this was true especially in the centuries before and then just after the establishment of Israel's monarchy that began with King Saul, and then the second king was King David. The capital city of the Assyrian Empire back in the earlier history was a city named Ashur, Ashur. This empire, the Assyrians, they were brutal, and their kings were enormously proud of their brutality. They gloated, and it shows up in the carvings. They gloated in depicting torture of their enemies, beheadings, depicting battlegrounds littered with the rotting corpses of enemy soldiers. They were known to amputate both of a captured soldier. They'd bring it back to their capital city, and when they got back to the capital city, they were known to amputate both of their legs and one of the arms, and while the soldier would be bleeding out from the stumps of these three appendages and all, the king would come and mockingly shake his hand with the one hand that remained while the soldier agonized, screaming in pain, and bled in front of him. Brutal stuff. They burned children alive. They skinned people alive. Sorry, not standard church conversations. I get it. When you think of the Assyrian Empire, we can maybe milk toast it a little bit. We can water down how horrible that empire was. Think ISIS back in the days of the beheadings from 10 plus years or so ago. Think people, white guys in trucks at night in the South pulling black men's bodies behind their trucks in the 1950s. Think Hamas, terror from our day, from October 7th of just last year. Hamas easily could have learned some of their tactics that have been recorded from ancient Assyria. God simply cannot ignore forever a culture that is that evil to its core. And part of his purpose for his own people, for those of us who are followers of God, is that we would call others to justice, but also that we would apply mercy and figure out the right balance of those two. Hear that again. God's people are called to pursue a balance of justice and mercy. So God calls his people to be messengers also of his grace, sometimes in contexts where we would prefer to be administering justice. And the sermon series that we're going to be looking at here today and in the weeks to come is going to touch on that. All right? Someone has to be willing to do exactly that. Someone has to go in with a message of justice and grace and end up opting for the better of the options depending on the response of the people. So here at church, I've placed a sign-up sheet out here in the entryway for anyone willing to go on a missions trip to Gaza to confront Hamas for their sins. Any volunteers out there? You can contact me or come to church sometime and sign up. No, there's not a sign-up sheet here. Anyone want to go to Iran to preach to the Ayatollah as he's leading a crowd to chant death to America? No, none of us are going to wish that we would go to a place like that. Let me go on record, all right? For as many times as I have ridiculed Green Bay Packers and Green Bay Packer fans, if I was given a choice 100 times between becoming a pastor across the border in Wisconsin among Packer fans or going to Gaza to tell Hamas leaders that Jesus doesn't approve of their cruelty, out of 100 times that I'd be given that choice, 100 times I would say, I'm going to Wisconsin, all right? Confronting Hamas sounds about as inviting as being appointed as a prophet to a biblical regime known for skinning foreigners alive. A regime whose royal city wasn't always Ashur. It eventually was moved to a different city called Nineveh. Does that ring a bell? In the weeks to come, we're going to study an Old Testament prophet who was told this by God. Go to the great city of Nineveh, which was the royal city at that point in time of the Assyrian Empire, and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. Now here's my guess. When you have read or heard that verse before, and you've heard that word for their wickedness has come up before me, my guess is this, all right, that you perhaps are very much like me. When I think of wickedness coming up before the throne of God, what would that include? Well, it would probably include drunkenness. It would probably include some type of sexual immorality, adultery perhaps. It might include bowing down before an idol. That sounds pretty wicked. It might include molesting of young girls, daughters in a family, all right? Friends, it was much, much worse than that. That pales in comparison to the atrocities that the Assyrian Empire was guilty of and needed to be confronted about, and to whom God was saying, and about whom God was telling Jonah, you go, you preach against that kingdom, you tell them that the God of Israel is not happy with their wickedness. Okay. Jonah, go to this bloodthirsty city that is Israel's greatest threat, whose armies slaughter their enemies even while they're begging for mercy. Jonah, condemn the king who shakes the remaining hand of the enemy general while he bleeds to death from the stumps of his legs. Jonah, go to the city where the women cheer when an enemy army officer is skinned alive in the city square. Tell their leaders that your foreign God, your foreign Jewish God, is going to bring judgment on them. Anyone think that that would be like, hey, I'm really glad I got that prophetic assignment? So you understand a bit of the background of the word wickedness a little bit better now. And I apologize. I don't want to be flippant in informing you on how brutal it was. But if we don't understand how brutal it was, we can never understand fully why did Jonah respond the way that Jonah responded. All right? Understand the background of the word wickedness as it pertains to Nineveh, and if you can understand it, you begin to get a feel for how Jonah had to have been terrified when God commands him to go. I have never been terrified to obey God. But in addition to background information on Nineveh, you want to know something in order for us to understand the biblical story of Jonah? It would help for us to have a little bit of background information about Jonah as well. And the information that I have to share with you may surprise you a little bit this morning or today, because apart from the basic story of Jonah and the big fish and Nineveh, he's pretty obscure. All right? Let me read some verses to you, though, that fills in a bit of the puzzle of the time frame that Jonah ministered in when he was a prophet. 2 Kings chapter 14, verse 23. Jeroboam became king in Israel, and he reigned 41 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord and did not turn away from any of the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he had called Israel to commit. So just a little clarification, a little summary here. There's actually two different Jeroboams that are talked about in these two verses. It can be a little bit confusing, all right? They rule at different times in the northern kingdom of Israel, all right? Jeroboam number 1 was the first king, actually, of the northern kingdom of Israel. He was the one who veered away from worship of God to establish his own forms of worship, which eventually veered further away into idolatry as the years went on. The Jewish kingdom that followed after Jeroboam the first, the kingdom of Israel in the northern part when the country became divided, that kingdom was described by kings every single time as evil kings. There was not one king in the northern kingdom that ever was referred to as being, he was a good king, he was a righteous king, he was a holy king. Southern kingdom kings were periodically referred to in those terms. In the north, not at all. All right? So when this is taking place, though, this is not first King Jeroboam, this is second King Jeroboam, hundreds of years later, all right? And he ruled, I should say hundreds of years later, about 150 years later, right? And he ruled when Israel's uninterrupted idol worship had been ongoing for 150 years, okay? They were a wicked people. Verse 25. I'll refer to this Jeroboam, the second Jeroboam, is Jeroboam II. Okay, so Jeroboam II was the one who, listen, restored the boundaries of Israel from Lebo Hamath, a city far to the north of Israel, from Lebo Hamath down to the Dead Sea, in accordance with the word of the Lord, the God of Israel. So, historians believe that Lebo Hamath was well into Syria. In fact, there's a city still there called Hama, H-A-M-A, all right, that most historians say this was this city that in the Bible, in this passage, is called Lebo or Lebo Hamath. All right, my point is this. This king, Jeroboam II, his reign included securing the borders. Listen to what it says. He was the one who restored the boundaries of Israel. He secured the borders. And who had prophesied about the need to secure the borders? Verse 25. Again, Jeroboam II was the one who restored the boundaries of Israel from Lebo Hamath to the Dead Sea in accordance with the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, spoken through his servant Jonah, son of Amittai, the prophet from Gath Hepher. Jonah is an established and recognized prophet in the land. He doesn't just surface in the whole story about go to Nineveh and the big fish. He's been around. He's a bona fide prophet. He's recognized by the king. He's been preaching for a while, and he's been telling the wicked king of Israel to restore Israel's boundaries. Some could say that Jonah was a nationalist, very possibly frustrated with enemies repeatedly disregarding Israel's borders in the north. But as we'll see, and listen carefully to this, Jonah's primary concern doesn't stay focused on a porous border. God has way, way more important things in mind for Jonah and for his ministry. His primary focus ends up becoming a people's sins, horrific sins. And so it continues, verse 26. The Lord had seen how bitterly everyone in Israel, whether slave or free, was suffering. There was no one to help them. And since the Lord had not said he would blot out the name of Israel from under heaven, he saved them by the hand of Jeroboam, son of Jehoash. He saved them by the hand of Jeroboam II. All right? Now, as for the other events of Jeroboam's reign, we're told in verse 28, all that he did and his military achievements, including how he recovered for Israel both Damascus and Hamath, which had belonged to Judah, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Israel? So, King Jeroboam II, he has a reputation. And his reputation revolves around his military achievements. His reputation of military conquest. He took back not just Lebo Hamath, which was way up in the north, but he also took back a closer city, Damascus. We're very familiar with that city because it's mentioned in the story of Acts with Saul, the guy who went there to kill Christians. Both Damascus and Hamath back in the day were important cities in Syria. Not Assyria, but in Syria. And King Jeroboam was instrumental in, listen to this, making Israel great again. Let's secure our borders. Let's reestablish the greatness that we used to have when the kingdom was combined under David. This is who Jonah would be perceived as representing when he got to Nineveh. The king who had reclaimed territory to the west of Assyria in the nation that we understand now as Syria, and that was understood back then as Syria as well. So imagine the potential conversations when Jonah could get there. He had to have been thinking through scenarios in his mind. So, the king of Assyria in Nineveh tells him, so, Jonah from Israel, you've come here to Nineveh to tell us to stop our atrocities. Well, do you know King Jeroboam personally? Are you his envoy? Are you his ambassador? Do you speak on his behalf? Because, to be totally honest, we're not quite very thrilled with how he defeated our cousins over to the west in Syria. We're not told anything about Israel's conquests or reconquests of Hamath and Damascus, but seriously, this was a kingdom that Israel was a kingdom that had always had kings described as being wicked. Do we seriously think that these idol-worshipping soldiers who had served under these idol-worshipping kings in Israel for years and years, that when they went out to battle for an evil king, that they would have been humane and honorable in all the treatment of an enemy that just defeated them, an enemy that was more than willing to take their lives? Let's not be naive. Rumors filtered out back in those days, just like they do in our day. They filter out to regional people groups. Israel certainly had a reputation. Nineveh knew the reputation of Israel. He also knew the reputation of Nineveh. Further, scholars think, and this isn't unanimous, many scholars think, that up until this time, God's prophets were primarily sent to their own leaders. They were sent to the kings of Judah or the kings of Israel. All right? And they stayed within the confines of Israel. Going across a border, a national border, going into the capital city and speaking to the powers that be in this significant city, 120,000 we find out later, probably sounded as inviting to Jonah as Daniel being told, hey, why don't you spend the night in the lion's den with this pack of lions? All right? So this was not like when you signed up to be a prophet, you knew that on the job description there was going to be this addendum or this addition to it that said, oh, by the way, down the road you might end up going to hostile territory and speaking truth to them as well. All right? It was already difficult enough for prophets to do that in their own country when evil kings like King Jeroboam would hear messages that they didn't fully agree with. All right? That's the background to this book of Jonah that we'll be looking at in the weeks to come. And I ask this question again, so what, Larry? You've given us a history lesson. Well, as we're going to see in the weeks to come, and we have to set the plate. We have to come to an understanding of what's included here so that we can understand what's going through Jonah's mind and what is God calling him to do. As we'll see in the weeks to come, there's much about Jonah that is unacceptable, and it is dishonorable for one of God's prophets. But knowing the context more fully has already left me with a few takeaways that focus on any tendencies we might have to judge him or to judge others. And I can be good at judging others, or bad as it were. The first is this. Before I am quick to judge someone, I need to remember that everyone has a story, and every person's story is important. Every person's story affects the path that they choose in life. A while back, one of our friends who has never attended this church, lives down in the cities, made a comment that came out pretty sour. The type of comment that gets said when emotions are a bit raw, the type of comment that you wake up the next day and you go, man, I got some regrets for having said that. As Nancy and I were discussing it after the comment was made, I told her that I needed to remember that our friend's history of relationship pain can still sometimes spill over, and that her comment wasn't meant to target us or anyone else directly. Do you know how easy it is, though, for us to take personal offense rather than take into account the reality of someone else's story? Everyone has a backstory. Jonah had a backstory. Until this week, like many of us, maybe all of us, I didn't know, much about Jonah's backstory. But now that we do know, we can't discount it. We can't just read these verses that we're going to be looking at, these 4 chapters. They're short chapters. We can't just be looking at these in the weeks to come without knowing that Nineveh was like a horrible place to have to go, a horrible place to have to live. And that Jonah had a past that was pretty significantly focused on establishing Israel's borders. Let's build our nation up. And safety was involved in Jonah's story. So we're going to read the story of Jonah differently, I think, in the weeks to come. Well, guess what? Not only do you have a backstory, and does Jonah have a backstory, but God has a backstory as well. And that leads to my second takeaway, all right? And that is this. Before we judge God's goodness, remember that he has a perspective that's greater than yours. Some of you might be familiar with a verse from Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 55, verse 8, where it says, my thoughts, God speaking, my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways. God is speaking here, and he's saying, you understand at one level, I understand at a totally different level. There's much more to this world, to our situations, than what we might be able to see from the surface. Recently I read this. This was just like such a good quote. And I don't have it exactly word for word the way I read it because I couldn't track it down. All right. Anyways, it was along these lines. Judging God's goodness in the middle of our crisis is like walking into the middle of a 3-hour movie, watching 30 seconds of it, and then getting up and leaving while we criticize the storyline that doesn't make any sense to us. Let's give God more credit than us. We don't know the end of the stories that he's writing in our lives. Let's be as gracious in giving to God the benefit of the doubt that God gives to us. And then there's a third takeaway that comes actually out of the first one, not out of the second one, all right? This was a humongous command to Jonah from God. I've never had to obey a command even 1/10 as difficult as what Jonah was being asked to do. An appropriate posture to take as we examine the great obedience challenge that Jonah faced might be for us to just take some time as we're reading through this chapter and periodically look in the mirror and reflect on our personal level of obedience, when it will be easy for us to criticize Jonah's personal level of disobedience and bitterness. Remember, it was Jesus who said in Matthew 7, verse 3, in the Sermon on the Mount, he said, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? As I was reflecting on that verse in writing this message, which, in other words, he's essentially saying, examine your own life, your own heart first before you start pointing out faults in other people's lives. Anyways, as I was reflecting on this, something hit me. You know, the most common thing that I remove from my eye when I've got something that's bothering me a little bit, you know what the most common thing is? It's one of my own eyelashes. That's probably true for you as well. It's never, almost never, a speck of sawdust. All right? But Jesus doesn't use the word eyelash here. He uses a word that means a tiny little speck of wood, a little teeny wood chip. 2 irritants are mentioned in this verse, a tiny little wood chip and a large plank. And obviously Jesus is being facetious in this example that he gives. But as I was reflecting on that, it hit me. The nature of the object in the eyes is the same. They're both made of wood. One's just larger than the other. 2 offenses, same type of offense, different sizes. Before I am quick to judge someone else's actions, I would be wise to thoroughly examine my life and my heart for a different type of the very same offense before God. Jonah's refusal to obey, as we see coming out. You want to know something? We might be really highly critical of that when God is saying, there is much more reason for me to be disappointed in your level of disobedience than you have to be in Jonah's level of disobedience. When I shared just a moment ago, before I'm quick to judge someone's actions, I would be wise to thoroughly examine my life and my heart for a different type of the same offense before God. You know, doing that with Jonah's story was actually kind of easy for me on a surface level, and that can be applied in many deeper levels as well. But at its core, what was Jonah called to? He was called to go to a nation and to speak truth to them, even though they were known to be a hostile crowd. That's a pretty tall task. All right? His hesitancy to do so might be like a small little speck of wood in comparison to us, you and me. Because you and I have also been called. We've been called by God to speak truth to others, to be Jesus Christ's ambassadors in our world, not facing being skinned alive or having our throats cut, facing at worst what? Rejection? Ridicule? You see, God called all of us to this task of speaking truth when he said, go into all the world and preach the gospel. Share the good news. My part of the world hasn't included anyone who's ever threatened to take my life, even in my years as a missionary in Africa. That never was on the radar screen anywhere. So why do we still hesitate? Why do you still hesitate? Why do we give ourselves license to disobey this most important command of God's? Well, we look at Jonah's disobedience and say, why didn't he just do what God told him to do? I am sometimes so unfaithful to this that I can sometimes go days and forget to pray by name for lost people in my life that I want to see come to Jesus, that I'm trying to reach out to in various capacities. So in the weeks to come, we're going to examine and see how Jonah boarded a ship to avoid speaking truth to people that he believed were dangerous. And I would propose to you that it's likely that all of us have boarded our own types of ships to remove ourselves from the task that God has called us to do, and to give a reason for why we do it that makes sense in our heart and allows us to sleep at night, when in reality God would be saying, you got a plank in your eye, and you ought to take care of it. And before you blast Jonah's disobedience, look in the mirror. You've got a share of it in your own life as well. Go ahead. Feel free to read ahead in the book of Jonah. Become more familiar with this story, to refamiliarize yourself with the story in the weeks to come. I'm looking forward to sharing more truth with you from this great story. Let's pray. Father God, my guess is that Jonah probably never found it real easy to thank you for the call that you had placed in his life to go and to share truth with a wicked nation that needed to turn to a God of grace, a God of mercy. And there are times when you call us to do some things that are hard for us, and we shrink back from that. We don't fully obey. We partially obey, thinking that that's obedience, and partial obedience is always disobedience. So God, as we look at this man who came from a country where the king respected him, where the king said, yes, I'll do what you tell me to do as far as reestablishing the borders, and Jonah was comfortable in that, and then he called him out of that into something that was really, really, really hard. Would you give us hearts that are open to hearing what you are saying to us, and to the reality that perhaps you might be calling us to something challenging, something difficult, something that's outside our comfort zone, but you were looking for us to be obedient because somebody's life, somebody's story, somebody's eternal story hangs in the balance. This is my prayer. I ask it in Jesus Christ's name. Amen. Thanks for joining us. I'm looking forward to finding out more about this story and sharing it with you. God bless you all.